Eleanor Willow Harrington stood 6 feet tall in her stocking feet, and folks in our Ray, Colorado never let her forget it. The summer of 1878 had brought nothing but sideways glances and whispered judgments, until the day Franklin Wade rode into town with his easy smile and eyes that saw beyond her height to the woman beneath. The morning sun cast long shadows across our Ray's Main Street as Eleanor strode purposefully toward the Mercantile. Her brown boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each determined step. At 22, she'd grown accustomed to the stairs, but that didn't mean they hurt any less. Her mother had always said that Eleanor had been blessed with presence, a gentle way of saying she towered over most women and a fair number of men in town. "Morning, Miss Harrington," called Mr. Peterson from his barbershop. He was one of the few townspeople who treated her with genuine kindness. "Good morning," she replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She tugged self-consciously at the sleeves of her blue cotton dress, custom-made to accommodate her long limbs. Store-bought dresses always hung awkwardly on her frame, too short at the ankles and wrists. The bell above the Mercantile door announced her arrival. Mrs. Bennett, the owner's wife, glanced up from behind the counter and offered a tight smile. Eleanor felt herself straighten her already impeccable posture, a habit formed from years of trying to appear less imposing by not slouching, though it inevitably had the opposite effect. "Just the usual supplies, Mrs. Bennett," Eleanor said, handing over her carefully written list. As Mrs. Bennett gathered the items, the door chimed again. Eleanor didn't need to look to know who had entered Cordelia Mason and her two friends. At barely 5 feet tall, Cordelia was everything Eleanor was not: petite, delicate, and universally deemed properly feminine. "My goodness," Cordelia Stage whispered to her companions. "I always forget how she blocks out the sun when she stands in the doorway." Heat rushed to Eleanor's cheeks, but she kept her eyes forward. The comments were nothing new. Since childhood, Eleanor had endured nicknames like Giant, Beanpole, and Amazon, the last one delivered with particular venom, as though comparing her to mythical warrior women was the gravest insult imaginable. "That'll be $1.65, Mrs. Bennett announced, mercifully interrupting Cordelia's poorly concealed snickering. Eleanor counted out the coins, conscious of how her hands, too, were larger than most women's. Practical for the work at her father's ranch, but another trait that made her stand out in all the wrong ways. "Thank you," she murmured, gathering her parcels. The trip back to the ranch was a relief. The open country never judged her. The mountains surrounding our Ray stood tall and proud, and Eleanor found comfort in their majestic presence. Her family's ranch, Harrington Haven, lay 3 miles outside town, close enough for convenience, but far enough for peace. The ranch had been her sanctuary since her mother's death 5 years ago. Eleanor had stepped into the role of woman of the house, caring for her father and younger brother while managing the domestic affairs of the ranch. She'd learned to cook, clean, and sew with the same determination she applied to everything, though her height made even these tasks subject to comment when visitors came calling. "There you are," her father, George Harrington, called as she approached the house. His weathered face brightened at the sight of her. If anyone had never made her feel different, it was her father. "How was town?" "Same as always," she replied, forcing lightness into her tone. She wouldn't burden him with the petty cruelties of our Ray's residents. He had enough to worry about with the ranch struggling through a difficult season. "Well, I've got news that might brighten things up," he said, taking some of the parcels from her arms. "Got a letter from the widow Simmons. She's selling her property up north, lock, stock, and barrel. Needs to move east to care for her ailing sister." Eleanor followed him into the house, setting her purchases on the kitchen table. "And why would that brighten things up for us?" "Because I've convinced Tom Hayes to partner with me on buying it. 50 acres of prime grazing land, Ellie. It could be the answer to our problems." Eleanor's heart sank. Tom Hayes was a decent enough rancher, but his son, Peter, had been one of her most persistent tormentors in school. The thought of increased dealings with the Hayes family made her stomach knot. "That's wonderful news," she managed, unpacking the flour and sugar. "And there's more," her father continued, his excitement palpable. "Hayes mentioned a foreman he's bringing on, fellow by the name of Wade, who's got experience with the kind of cattle operation we're planning. Supposed to arrive in our array today." Eleanor nodded, only half listening as she mentally calculated how much stew she'd need to make for dinner with her 15-year-old brother James's seemingly bottomless appetite. "Pa," James's voice rang out from the yard. "Ryder coming." George moved to the window. "Speak of the devil, I believe that's our new partner's foreman now." Eleanor smoothed her hair and straightened her apron, not out of vanity but habit. First impressions were important, even if they inevitably led to the same looks of surprise at her height. She followed her father onto the porch, squinting against the afternoon sun as a rider approached. The man sat tall in the saddle, his broad-shouldered silhouette distinct against the backdrop of mountains. As he drew closer, she could make out a strong jaw shadowed with stubble and a cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes. He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. When he removed his hat, Eleanor was struck by eyes the color of a summer sky and hair the shade of wheat fields. He was tall, not as tall as her father perhaps, but tall enough that, when his gaze met hers, she didn't have to look down as she did with most men. "Mr. Harrington," he said, extending a hand to her father. "Franklin Wade. Tom Hayes sent me over to introduce myself before we get to work tomorrow." "Glad to meet you, Wade," her father replied, shaking his hand firmly. "This is my daughter, Eleanor." Franklin Wade turned those blue eyes on her, and Eleanor braced herself for the familiar flicker of surprise, the quick up-and-down assessment, the subtle step back that most men took when confronted with her height. Instead, he smiled, a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and held out his hand to her as well. "Miss Harrington, it's a pleasure." His grip was strong, his hand calloused from work, and he didn't let go right away. "Welcome to Harrington Haven, Mr. Wade," she said, surprised at how steady her voice sounded when something inside her had suddenly become very unsteady indeed. "Please, call me Frank," he said, still holding her gaze without a hint of discomfort. "You must be tired after your journey," she offered, slipping back into her role as hostess. "Would you care for some coffee? That would be mighty appreciated, Miss Harrington." "Eleanor," she corrected, surprising herself with the informality. His smile widened. "Eleanor, then." As she turned to prepare the coffee, she felt something unfamiliar flutter in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. Frank Wade proved to be unlike any man Eleanor had ever met. Over coffee at the kitchen table, he spoke of his experiences working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, of 2 years spent mining in Montana, and of his decision to put down roots somewhere beautiful like our array. "And what about you, Miss Eleanor?" he asked, his attention fully on her in a way few people's ever was. "Have you lived in our array all your life?" "Born and raised," she replied. "Though I did spend a year in Denver with my aunt after finishing school." "Denver," he mused. "Fine city, but too crowded for my taste. Give me mountains and open sky any day." "That's exactly how I felt," she admitted. "I couldn't wait to come home despite," she stopped herself, not wanting to reveal the truth, that despite our array's beauty, its people had never made her feel truly at home. Frank seemed to read something in her expression. Despite the fact that some places don't always appreciate what makes a person special, the directness of his observation caught her off guard. "Something like that," she murmured. Their conversation was interrupted by James bursting through the door, all gangly limbs and adolescent energy. At 15, he was already taller than many grown men and showed every sign of eventually matching their father's 6'3" frame. "Pa says to tell you the fence in the north pasture needs mending before we move the herd," he announced, then noticed Frank. "Oh, you must be the new foreman." "James," Eleanor admonished gently. "Where are your manners?" Her brother grinned unrepentantly. "Sorry, Ellie." "I mean you must be the new foreman, sir." Frank laughed, a rich sound that filled the kitchen. "Frank Wade," he said, standing to shake James's hand. "And you're right on both counts." "I'd best help your father," Frank said, turning to Eleanor. "Thank you for the coffee and conversation, Miss Eleanor." "You're welcome anytime, Mr. Wade," she replied, and meant it. As the days passed, Frank became a fixture at Harrington Haven. He worked alongside her father and brother from dawn until dusk, earning her father's respect with his knowledge of cattle and his willingness to tackle the hardest tasks himself. More than once, Eleanor caught herself watching him from the kitchen window as he worked, admiring the confident way he moved and the respect he showed everyone around him. Unlike Peter Hayes, who visited the ranch often and never missed an opportunity to make some comment about Eleanor standing out in a crowd, Frank treated her with a consistent courtesy that bordered on admiration. One evening, as she carried a basket of freshly baked bread to the bunkhouse where Frank had taken up residence with two other ranch hands, she overheard voices through the open window. "Don't see why you're spending so much time over at the main house," came Peter Hayes's unmistakable drawl. He often stopped by to deliver messages from his father. "Unless it's to get a look at the Harrington giantess. Quite a sight, ain't she? Taller than half the men in town." Eleanor froze, the familiar hurt washing over her. She was about to turn back when Frank's voice cut through the air, sharp as a knife. "I'd appreciate it if you'd show Miss Harrington some respect, Hayes. She's a lady deserving of proper courtesy." "Come on, Wade. You can't tell me you find her appealing." "No man wants a woman who can look him straight in the eye or worse, look down on him. It ain't natural." There was a sudden scrape of a chair being pushed back forcefully. "I find intelligence, kindness, and dignity appealing, Hayes, all qualities Miss Harrington possesses in abundance." "Now, was there something specific your father needed, or are you just here to run your mouth?" The tension in Frank's voice made Eleanor's heart pound. No one had ever defended her like that before. "Just delivering a message," Peter muttered. "Pa wants to meet tomorrow about moving those new cattle to the north property." "Tell him I'll be there at noon," Frank replied, his tone clipped. Eleanor heard footsteps approaching the door and quickly stepped aside, heart racing. Peter emerged, his face flushed with anger. He barely glanced at her before mounting his horse and riding off. Taking a deep breath, she approached the bunkhouse door and knocked. Frank appeared, surprise registering on his face before it softened into a smile. "Miss Eleanor, what brings you out here?" She held up the basket, suddenly tongue-tied. "Fresh bread, for you and the men." "That's mighty thoughtful of you." He took the basket, his fingers brushing hers. "Would you like to come in for a moment? Coffee's still hot." She hesitated, aware of the impropriety of entering the bunkhouse alone, yet unable to walk away. "Just for a moment," she agreed. Inside, the small building was surprisingly tidy. A pot of coffee bubbled on the small stove, and the other two ranch hands were nowhere to be seen. "They're out checking the herd," Frank explained, following her gaze. "Should be back before dark." He poured her a cup of coffee and they sat at the rough wooden table. "I heard what Peter said," she admitted after a moment of silence, "and what you said in return." Frank's expression remained steady, though a flush crept up his neck. "I apologize that you had to hear any of that." "Don't apologize. No one's ever." She swallowed hard. "No one's ever defended me like that before." His eyes held hers, serious and intense. "Then a lot of people have failed you. Eleanor Harrington." The way he said her name like it was something precious made her breath catch. In that moment, with the late afternoon sun streaming through the window and Frank Wade looking at her as though she were the most fascinating person he'd ever encountered, Eleanor felt beautiful for the first time in her life. "Thank you," she whispered. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Nothing to thank me for. I only spoke the truth." The connection between them was palpable, a current of understanding that needed no words. Eleanor found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone about: the years of comments about her height, the dresses that never fit right, the dances she'd attended where no one asked her to waltz because they feared looking ridiculous next to her. Frank listened, really listened, his thumb occasionally brushing over her knuckles in a gesture of comfort. When she finished, he shared his own story of growing up the son of a poor farmer in Kansas, of losing both parents to fever when he was 17, of making his way in the world alone until he found a home in the life of a cowboy. "We're both outsiders in our own way," he observed. "Maybe that's why I recognized something in you from the first moment we met." The conversation might have continued for hours if not for the sound of riders approaching, signaling the return of the other hands. Eleanor reluctantly withdrew her hand from Frank's and stood. "I should get back to the house," she said, suddenly aware of how long she'd been gone. Frank walked her to the door. "Will you ride with me tomorrow? I'd like to show you something on the north property." "I'd like that," she replied, unable to suppress her smile. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Eleanor dressed with unusual care, selecting her best riding skirt and a blue blouse that her mother had always said matched her eyes. She braided her long chestnut hair and secured it at the nape of her neck, practical for riding but neat enough to look presentable. Frank was waiting by the stables, 2 horses saddled and ready. Her mare, Maple, and his gelding, Rusty, stood patiently side by side. "Good morning," he greeted her, his eyes warming as they took in her appearance. "Ready for an adventure? Lead the way, Mr. Wade," she replied, allowing him to help her mount even though she'd been riding since childhood and needed no assistance. His hands at her waist felt strong and reassuring, and the momentary closeness sent a thrill through her. They rode north, following the winding trail that led to the newly purchased Simmons property. Frank was a natural horseman, sitting easy in the saddle with the confidence of someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. Eleanor kept pace beside him, enjoying the crisp morning air and the companionable silence. "You ride well," he observed as they crested a hill overlooking a lush valley. "Most ladies I've known prefer side saddle." Eleanor laughed. "I tried side saddle once at my aunt's insistence in Denver. It was terribly uncomfortable, and I nearly broke my neck when the horse spooked at a rabbit." "Practical as well as beautiful," Frank commented, as casually as if he were remarking on the weather. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected compliment. No man had ever called her beautiful before. Pretty, perhaps, with qualifiers like, "if only she weren't so tall," attached. They stopped at the edge of a clear mountain stream that cut through the property. Frank dismounted and helped Eleanor from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "This is what I wanted to show you," he said, leading her to a small clearing just beyond the stream. Wildflowers carpeted the ground in patches of blue, yellow, and purple. A cluster of aspen trees provided dappled shade, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. "It's lovely," Eleanor breathed, taking in the secluded beauty of the spot. "I found it yesterday while checking property boundaries," Frank explained. "Reminded me of a place back in Kansas where my mother used to take me for picnics." His voice held a touch of wistfulness. "Thought you might appreciate it." "I do," she assured him, touched that he would share something so personal with her. "Thank you for bringing me here." They sat by the stream, Frank spreading his coat on the ground for Eleanor. He'd brought along a small parcel of food biscuits, jerky, and 2 apples which they shared while watching the clear water rush over smooth stones. "What do you want, Eleanor?" Frank asked suddenly, his blue eyes serious. The directness of the question startled her. "What do you mean, from life?" "From your future. If you could have anything, what would it be?" Eleanor considered the question, touched that he would ask when most people simply assumed they knew what was best for her. "I want." She began, then paused, organizing her thoughts. "I want to be seen. Not just looked at, but truly seen for who I am, not merely what I appear to be." Frank nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I want a partnership," she continued, finding courage in his attentiveness. "Not just marriage for the sake of not being alone, but a true partnership with someone who values my thoughts and abilities. And—" she hesitated, then decided to be completely honest. "And I want a family of my own someday, children who never feel they have to apologize for the way God made them." A smile spread slowly across Frank's face. "Those are fine wants, Eleanor Harrington, worthy ones. And you?" she asked, curious now. "What does Franklin Wade want from life?" He picked up a small stone, turning it over in his fingers before skipping it across the stream. "Land of my own someday. A home built with my own hands. And a woman beside me who makes that home worth returning to every day, someone with fire in her spirit and kindness in her heart." His eyes met hers. Someone tall enough to reach the high shelves would be a practical bonus. The teasing comment, delivered with such warmth, made Eleanor laugh out loud, a genuine, unrestrained sound that echoed in the clearing. It felt like freedom, sitting there with a man who could joke about her height without malice, who seemed to find it an attractive quality rather than a flaw. The rest of the morning passed in easy conversation. Frank told her about his dreams of building a cattle operation that would allow him to settle permanently in Colorado. Eleanor shared her love of books, her secret talent for sketching, and her hopes that her brother James would have opportunities she never did. As the sun climbed higher, they reluctantly agreed it was time to head back. The ride home was filled with the same comfortable conversation, punctuated by moments of charged silence when their eyes would meet and hold for a heartbeat longer than necessary. When they reached Harrington Haven, Frank helped her dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. Eleanor found herself standing very close to him, close enough to notice the tiny flecks of darker blue in his eyes, the single freckle near his left temple, the way his lips curved up slightly at one corner when he looked at her. "Thank you for riding with me today, Eleanor," he said softly. "Thank you for asking me," she replied, equally quiet. The sound of the door opening broke the moment. James burst out of the house, excitement written across his young face. "Ellie, there you are. Guess what? Mrs. Tillman just rode over to invite us all to the harvest dance on Saturday. Even Pa's going." The annual harvest dance was Aure's biggest social event of the fall, held in the town hall with decorations of autumn leaves and pumpkins, a proper band brought in from Denver, and enough food to feed the entire county. Eleanor usually attended out of obligation, spending most of the evening helping serve refreshments or chatting with the older ladies while other young women her age danced and flirted. "That's wonderful, James," she said, stepping back from Frank. "I'm sure you'll have a fine time." "We'll all have a fine time," James corrected, oblivious to the moment he'd interrupted. Mrs. Tillman specifically mentioned you, said she hopes to see you there. He turned to Frank. You're invited too, Mr. Wade. The whole town comes. Frank's eyes hadn't left Eleanor's face. Will you be attending, Miss Harrington? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. I suppose I will, she answered slowly. Then I look forward to Saturday evening, Frank replied, a promise in his voice that made her heart skip. The days leading up to the harvest dance were filled with anticipation and preparation. Eleanor pulled out her best dress, a deep green creation with ivory trim that her mother had commissioned from a Denver dressmaker before her death. It was one of the few formal gowns Eleanor owned that truly fit her tall frame. On Saturday evening, she stood before the mirror in her bedroom, scarcely recognizing the woman who looked back at her. The green of the dress brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes, and she'd arranged her hair in a more sophisticated style than her usual practical braid, with soft tendrils framing her face. You look like Mama, James said from the doorway, already dressed in his Sunday best. At 15, he was attempting to grow a mustache, with minimal success. Eleanor smiled at him in the mirror. That's the nicest compliment you could give me. Their father appeared behind James, looking uncomfortable in his formal clothes but handsome nonetheless. Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become, Ellie, he said, his voice gruff with emotion. Now, we'd best get going if we're to be on time. The town hall was transformed when they arrived, lanterns casting a warm glow over autumn decorations and trestle tables laden with food. A 5-piece band from Denver was setting up on a small stage, and already the room was filling with Our Ray's residents in their finest attire. Eleanor felt the familiar stares as she entered. She'd always stood out in a crowd, but tonight in her elegant dress, with her hair arranged and a touch of her mother's rose water dabbed at her wrists, the looks held a different quality. Surprise, certainly, but also a grudging admiration from some of the women and confused reassessment from several men who'd never looked twice at her before. Her height, always her most noticeable feature, somehow seemed different tonight, regal rather than awkward, distinctive rather than abnormal. Perhaps it was the dress, cut to flatter her long lines. Or perhaps it was the new confidence she felt, born from the way Frank Wade looked at her as though she were precisely as she should be. Speaking of Frank, Eleanor scanned the room, her heart quickening when she spotted him near the refreshment table, engaged in conversation with Tom Hayes. He was dressed in what were clearly his best clothes: dark trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a proper jacket rather than his usual work attire. His hair was neatly combed, though one rebellious lock had already fallen across his forehead in a way she found endearing. As if sensing her presence, he looked up, his eyes finding hers across the crowded room. The smile that spread across his face made her breath catch. He excused himself from Mr. Hayes and made his way toward her, weaving through clusters of townspeople with determined grace. Miss Harrington, he greeted her, his eyes warm with appreciation. You look absolutely stunning this evening. Thank you, Mr. Wade, she replied, suddenly shy under his admiring gaze. You look quite handsome yourself. A flush of pleasure colored his tanned cheeks. Would you do me the honor of saving me a dance later? Before she could respond, Cordelia Mason appeared at Frank's elbow, her diminutive form accentuated by a frilly pink dress that made her look like an elaborately decorated cake. Mr. Wade, she simpered, batting her eyelashes, I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Cordelia Mason. Frank turned to her with polite disinterest. Pleased to meet you, Miss Mason. I heard you're new to our Ray, Cordelia continued, edging slightly in front of Eleanor with practiced skill. I'd be happy to introduce you to everyone who matters in town. The implication that Eleanor wasn't among everyone who matters was clear, but Frank merely smiled thinly. "That's very kind of you, Miss Mason, but I've already met the person who matters most to me in our array." His eyes returned to Eleanor's face, the sincerity in them unmistakable. Cordelia's expression soured. "Well, I'm sure Eleanor is happy to have made a new friend." The pause before friend was deliberate, loaded with insinuation. "Though I can't imagine what you find to talk about, unless you're discussing how the weather is up there where she stands." Eleanor felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but before she could respond, Frank spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Miss Mason, where I come from, a lady's character is measured by the kindness she shows others, not by cutting remarks meant to wound. Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe the first dance is about to begin, and Miss Harrington has graciously agreed to partner with me." He offered his arm to Eleanor, who took it with a mixture of shock and gratitude. Cordelia stood speechless as Frank led Eleanor toward the dance floor where couples were already gathering. "I don't recall agreeing to the first dance," Eleanor murmured, though she was smiling. Frank's eyes twinkled. "Consider it a rescue operation, then, for both of us." The band struck up a lively reel. Eleanor hesitated at the edge of the dance floor, years of sitting out dances making her suddenly unsure. Frank seemed to sense her nervousness. "Having second thoughts?" he asked quietly. She glanced around the room, aware of the curious eyes on them. "I haven't danced in years," she admitted, "and never with someone who wasn't significantly shorter than me." Frank stepped closer, his hand warm at the small of her back. "Then we're well matched, aren't we? I happen to think we'll fit together just fine." The confidence in his voice gave her courage. Eleanor allowed him to lead her onto the floor, where he took her right hand in his left and placed his other hand properly at her waist. The height difference between them was minimal. Her eyes were level with his nose, allowing her to look directly at him without the awkward downward gaze she'd experienced on the rare occasions she'd danced with other men. As they began to move with the music, Eleanor's initial stiffness melted away. Frank was an excellent dancer, leading with confidence but without dominance, his steps perfectly in time with the music. They moved together with surprising ease, as though they'd been dancing as partners for years rather than minutes. "See," he said, guiding her through a turn. "We fit perfectly." The genuine pleasure in his voice made her smile. "We do, don't we?" By the end of the first dance, Eleanor had forgotten her self-consciousness. By the third dance, a romantic waltz, she'd forgotten everyone else in the room. There was only Frank, his blue eyes never leaving hers, his hand steady at her back, guiding her in sweeping circles that made her green dress swirl around her ankles. When the music paused for a break, Frank reluctantly released her. "Would you like some punch?" "Yes, please," she replied, flushed from dancing and happiness. As Frank made his way to the refreshment table, Eleanor found herself approached by Mrs. Tillman, the butcher's wife and one of our Ray's most notorious gossips. "My dear," the older woman said, her eyes sharp with curiosity, "I had no idea you were so well acquainted with Mr. Wade. You two make quite the striking couple on the dance floor." "Thank you, Mrs. Tillman," Eleanor replied, unsure how else to respond. "Of course, not everyone can carry off such prominence," Mrs. Tillman continued. "Most men prefer a more delicate partner, but Mr. Wade seems quite taken with you, despite your unfortunate height." The backhanded nature of the comment was typical of Mrs. Tillman, but tonight, instead of feeling hurt, Eleanor found herself amused by the older woman's transparent attempt to gather gossip. "Mr. Wade has never given me any reason to think he finds my height unfortunate," she replied evenly. "Quite the contrary, in fact, Mrs. Tillman's eyebrows shot up. Indeed. How fascinating. I wonder what his prospects are. Tom Hayes speaks highly of his abilities as a foreman, but a foreman's salary isn't much to build a future on, is it? Eleanor bit back a retort about the inappropriate nature of such speculation. Fortunately, Frank returned at that moment with 2 cups of punch. "Mrs. Tillman," he greeted the older woman politely, "I hope you're enjoying the evening." "Oh, very much, Mr. Wade. I was just telling Miss Harrington how well you two dance together. Such a rare thing to see a couple so proportionate." Frank's lips twitched with suppressed laughter. "Proportionate? Yes, I suppose we are." He handed Eleanor her punch. "Would you care to step outside for some fresh air, Miss Harrington? It's rather warm in here." "That would be lovely," Eleanor agreed, grateful for the escape. Outside, the October night was crisp and clear. Stars scattered across the dark sky like diamonds on velvet. A few other couples strolled the boardwalk, but Frank led Eleanor to a quiet corner of the town hall's porch, where a bench sat partially concealed by potted evergreens. "Proportionate," he chuckled as they sat down. "I wonder what other qualities Mrs. Tillman might assign us if given the chance." Eleanor smiled, taking a sip of her punch. She was fishing for information about your prospects, as she put it. Was she indeed? Frank's expression grew more serious. "And what would you like to know about my prospects, Eleanor?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. That is, it's not my place to inquire about such things." Frank set his cup aside and turned to face her more fully on the bench. "What if I wanted it to be your place?" Eleanor's heart began to race. "Mr. Wade, Frank, we've known each other such a short time. 6 weeks, 4 days, and approximately 7 hours, he said, his lips curving in a small smile. "Not that I've been counting." The precision of his answer made her laugh softly. "That is quite specific. I notice things that matter to me," he replied simply. "And you, Eleanor Harrington, have mattered to me since the moment I saw you standing on your father's porch, looking like you expected me to turn and run at the sight of you." Her breath caught at the memory. "Most men do eventually. Run, that is, or at least step back. I'm not most men." Frank's hand found hers on the bench between them, his fingers warm and strong as they entwined with hers. "And I have no intention of running anywhere unless it's toward you." The sincerity in his voice made something bloom in her chest, a feeling of possibility she'd never allowed herself to entertain. "As for my prospects," he continued, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand, "I've been saving nearly every penny I've earned these past 5 years. I have enough to put a down payment on a small ranch of my own with good management and a bit of luck." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands. "Why are you telling me this?" Frank's other hand came up to gently tilt her chin, bringing her eyes back to his. "Because I want you to know that not if, but when I ask your father for permission to court you properly, I'll be doing so with honest intentions and the means to back them up." The world seemed to stop for a moment as his words sank in. "You want to court me?" His eyes softened with tenderness. "More than I've wanted anything in a very long time, Eleanor, if you'll have me." Inside the town hall, the band began playing again, the music drifting out to where they sat. Without speaking, Frank stood and pulled Eleanor gently to her feet. There on the porch, hidden from prying eyes by the potted evergreens, he drew her into his arms and began to dance. A slow, swaying movement that barely qualified as dancing at all, more an excuse to hold each other close. "You fit perfectly in my arms," he murmured, his breath warm against her temple. "As though you were made to be here." Eleanor closed her eyes, savoring the feeling of being held by someone who saw her height as an asset rather than a liability, who seemed to genuinely admire everything about her that others had criticized. "I'd like that very much," she whispered. "What's that?" Frank asked, drawing back slightly to see her face. "For you to court me," she clarified, feeling brave in the starlight. "If my father approves, of course." The smile that illuminated Frank's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I'll speak to him tomorrow," he promised. Then, with a hesitation that spoke of respect rather than reluctance, he asked, "Eleanor, may I kiss you?" Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "Yes," she breathed. Frank's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch reverent. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, he leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, almost tentative at first, but when Eleanor responded, her hands moving to his shoulders, it deepened into something that made her knees weak and her pulse race. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Frank rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the day I met you," he admitted. Eleanor smiled, feeling wonderfully dizzy. "I'm glad you waited until tonight. It made it perfect." The sound of the town hall door opening startled them apart, though Frank kept hold of her hand. George Harrington stepped onto the porch, his eyes finding them immediately. "There you are, Ellie," he said, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I was beginning to wonder where you'd gone off to." Eleanor felt a flash of guilt, though they'd done nothing wrong beyond sharing a single kiss. "We just stepped out for some air, Pa." Her father's gaze moved to their joined hands, then to Frank's face. "I see," he said neutrally. "Well, it's getting late and we should be heading home soon. James is practically falling asleep in the punch bowl." "Mr. Harrington," Frank said, straightening his shoulders, "if I might have a word with you tomorrow. There's a matter I'd like to discuss." A knowing look crossed her father's face. "I suspected there might be. Come by after breakfast, Wade. We'll talk then." With a nod to both of them, George retreated back inside, leaving Eleanor and Frank alone again. "That went better than I expected," Frank remarked, looking relieved. Eleanor squeezed his hand. "Pa likes you. He said more than once that you're the hardest working man he's ever hired." "Let's hope that opinion holds when I ask to court his daughter," Frank replied with a wry smile. They returned to the dance for one final waltz before the evening ended. This time, Eleanor was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them, but they no longer stung. "Let them talk," she thought as Frank guided her gracefully across the floor. "Let them see what it looks like when a woman is truly cherished." The ride home was quiet, James indeed half asleep in the back of the wagon while George drove. Eleanor sat beside her father, her mind replaying the evening's events, particularly that perfect kiss under the stars. "He's a good man," her father said suddenly, his voice low enough not to wake James. Eleanor turned to him, surprised. "Who?" George gave her a sideways look that said he wasn't fooled. "Wade. He's a good man, solid, knows his business and doesn't put on airs." "Yes," she agreed cautiously, "he is. I've seen how he looks at you, Ellie, and how you look at him." Her father kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Your mother would have liked him." The mention of her mother made Eleanor's throat tight with emotion. "Do you think so?" George nodded. "She always said you'd need a man who could see past the surface to the heart beneath." "Looks like Wade might be that man." Eleanor leaned her head against her father's shoulder, overwhelmed with gratitude for his understanding. "Thank you, Pa." The next morning, Eleanor was uncharacteristically nervous as she prepared breakfast. She'd taken extra care with her appearance, selecting a blue dress that Frank had once complimented and arranging her hair in a simple but flattering style. James noticed immediately. "Why are you all dressed up to cook breakfast?" he asked, shoveling eggs onto his plate. "And why do you keep looking out the window? Are you expecting someone?" Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "Eat your breakfast before it gets cold," she deflected. Her father, entering the kitchen at that moment, gave her a knowing look. Wade said he'd come by after breakfast, he reminded her. Which means you've got about 20 minutes to stop fussing with your hair and decide what you're going to say when I give him my permission. Eleanor stared at him, fork halfway to her mouth. You mean you've already decided? George sat down at the table and reached for the coffee pot. Been decided since I saw you two dancing last night, looking at each other like there was nobody else in the room. Reminds me of your mother and me, back when we were young. But don't you want to hear what he has to say first? Eleanor asked, astonished by her father's ready acceptance. I know what he's going to say, George replied, buttering a biscuit. Same thing I said to your grandfather 30 years ago, and I know what kind of man Wade is. I've watched him work, heard him talk. He's got plans, savings, and most importantly, he looks at you like you hung the moon and stars. What more could a father ask for? Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes. She'd never expected her father to be so readily supportive, had braced herself for at least some interrogation of Frank's intentions. Now don't start crying, George said gruffly, uncomfortable with emotion. You'll have your eyes all red when he gets here, and that's no way to start a courtship. Eleanor laughed through her threatening tears, reaching across to squeeze her father's hand. I love you, Pa. Love you too, Ellie girl, he replied, returning the squeeze. Always have, always will. James looked between them, confused. Wait, is Mr. Wade coming to court, Ellie? Does that mean they're getting married? It means they are officially seeing each other, with the possibility of marriage in the future, George explained patiently. Courtship comes before engagement, James. Oh. James considered this for a moment, then brightened. Does that mean Mr. Wade might become our brother? Because that would be swell. He promised to teach me how to throw a lasso properly. Eleanor and her father exchanged amused glances. If things work out, he'd be your brother-in-law, not your brother, Eleanor corrected gently. But that's getting quite ahead of ourselves. The sound of hoofbeats approaching the house made all three Harringtons look toward the window. Frank dismounted from Rusty, looking handsome if slightly nervous in clean work clothes, his hat in his hands. I'll just go upstairs and do something else, James announced with unusual tact, taking his plate with him. Tell Mr. Wade I said hello. George stood, wiping his mouth with a napkin. I'll receive him in the parlor. Give us a few minutes, Ellie, then you can join us. Eleanor nodded, her heart fluttering like a caged bird. She busied herself clearing the breakfast dishes, straining to hear the murmur of voices from the parlor, but unable to make out any words. The minutes crawled by like hours. Finally, after what seemed an eternity but was probably no more than 15 minutes, her father appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd like to see you now, George said, his expression softening at the sight of her nervous face. Don't worry, Ellie, I didn't bite him. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor smoothed her skirts and made her way to the parlor. Frank stood by the window, sunlight streaming in behind him, creating a halo effect around his tall figure. He turned as she entered, his face breaking into a smile that made her heart skip. Eleanor, he said, taking a step toward her. Frank, she replied, suddenly shy in the formal setting of the parlor, so different from the romantic darkness of the town hall porch. Your father has given his permission for me to court you, Frank told her, his voice steady though his eyes revealed his own nervousness. If that's still what you want. Eleanor clasped her hands in front of her to keep from reaching for him. It is, she answered simply. The joy that crossed his face made her breath catch. I promised your father I would conduct myself honorably at all times, he said, moving closer. Though he did allow that occasional hand-holding would not compromise your reputation. A laugh bubbled up from Eleanor's chest. How generous of him. Indeed, Frank agreed, reaching for her hand. though I confess I hope to negotiate the occasional kiss as well in due time. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her at his touch, at the tenderness in his eyes. I believe that might be arranged, she murmured. From that day forward, Eleanor and Frank's courtship became the talk of our ray. Some, like Cordelia Mason and her circle, expressed disbelief and made cutting remarks about matched pairs and breeding stock. But many more, seeing the genuine affection between the tall cowboy and the woman who'd been made to feel awkward her entire life, found themselves unexpectedly moved. Mrs. Tillman, ever the gossip, spread the word that Frank Wade was saving to buy his own ranch and that his prospects were quite promising. Tom Hayes, impressed by Frank's work ethic and vision, began hinting at a possible partnership beyond the current arrangement. And George Harrington watched with quiet satisfaction as his daughter bloomed under Frank's attentions, her confidence growing with each passing day. Frank called on Eleanor each Sunday after church, sometimes taking her for rides to show her beautiful spots he'd discovered in the surrounding mountains, other times simply sitting with her on the porch swing, talking about everything and nothing. They discovered shared interests in books. Frank was surprisingly well-read for a cowboy and music, with Eleanor teaching Frank to play simple tunes on the parlor piano. On Wednesdays, his half-day off, Frank would arrive with small tokens of affection, wildflowers gathered from the hillsides, a ribbon from the mercantile that matched her eyes, once even a small carved wooden horse that he'd whittled himself during evening hours in the bunkhouse. "It's not much," he apologized as he presented the carving, "but it made me think of you, strong and graceful like your maple." Eleanor cherished each gift, not for its monetary value but for the thought behind it, for the proof that Frank saw her, noticed her preferences, and cared enough to remember them. Winter came early to our ray that year, with the first heavy snow falling in early November. The mountains disappeared behind curtains of white, and the town settled in for the long, cold months ahead. Far from dampening their courtship, the winter weather gave Eleanor and Frank new opportunities to grow closer. On snowy evenings, Frank would join the Harringtons for dinner and stay to play checkers with James or discuss ranching strategies with George. Eleanor loved these domestic scenes, watching Frank interact so easily with her family, imagining a future where such evenings were the norm rather than the exception. As Christmas approached, anticipation for our Ray's annual Christmas Eve dance ran high. For Eleanor, the event held special significance. It would mark 3 months since she and Frank had begun courting, 3 months that had transformed her life in ways she'd never imagined possible. The night of the dance arrived clear and cold, stars glittering like ice crystals in the black sky. Frank came to collect Eleanor in a borrowed sleigh, the horses adorned with bells that jingled merrily as they approached Harrington Haven. Eleanor wore a new dress for the occasion, a deep red creation she'd spent weeks sewing in secret, using a pattern sent by her aunt in Denver. The bodice fit perfectly across her shoulders, and the skirt, fuller than her usual practical attire, swished pleasingly when she moved. "You look absolutely beautiful," Frank said when she appeared on the porch, his admiration evident in his voice and eyes. "Thank you," she replied, accepting his hand to step into the sleigh. "You look rather handsome yourself." He did indeed, dressed in a new suit he'd ordered from Denver, his normally unruly hair tamed and his blue eyes bright with happiness. The journey to town was magical, with the sleigh gliding smoothly over packed snow and the moon casting blue-white light over the landscape. Frank tucked a warm blanket around Eleanor's legs and kept one arm around her shoulders, holding her close against the cold. "I have something for you," he said as they neared our ray, An early Christmas gift. Oh. Eleanor watched as he reached into his pocket with his free hand and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with red ribbon. "Open it," he encouraged. With gloved fingers, Eleanor untied the ribbon and carefully unwrapped the paper. Inside was a small box, which she opened to reveal a delicate silver brooch in the shape of an aspen leaf, detailed with remarkable craftsmanship. "Frank," she breathed, "it's beautiful. It reminded me of our first real outing together at the aspen grove by the stream," he explained. "And like those trees, you stand tall and beautiful, bending with life's winds but never breaking." Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes, not just at the lovely gift but at the thought and meaning behind it. "Thank you," she whispered, leaning up to kiss his cheek. "I'll treasure it always." Frank helped her pin the brooch to her dress just as they arrived at the town hall. The building was transformed for Christmas, with evergreen boughs and red ribbons decorating every available surface, and a massive pine tree in the corner, adorned with homemade ornaments and real candles that cast a warm glow over the proceedings. This time, as Eleanor entered on Frank's arm, the stares they received were different from those at the harvest dance. In the months since they'd begun courting, the town had grown accustomed to seeing them together. What's more, Frank's hard work and integrity had earned him respect, while Eleanor's newfound confidence had changed how she carried herself and, consequently, how others perceived her. "Miss Harrington, Mr. Wade," Mrs. Tillman greeted them enthusiastically, her husband nodding beside her. "Don't you both look splendid this evening? That brooch is exquisite, my dear." Eleanor touched the silver leaf at her collar. "Thank you. It was an early Christmas gift from Frank." Mrs. Tillman exchanged a knowing look with her husband. "How lovely." "You know, Mr. Wade, we've all been so pleased to see how happy you've made our Eleanor. She positively glows these days." The genuine warmth in the older woman's voice, free of the backhanded compliments that had characterized their previous interactions, took Eleanor by surprise. "It's entirely mutual, Mrs. Tillman," Frank replied smoothly. "Eleanor has brought more joy to my life than I thought possible." As they moved through the crowd, similar greetings met them from all sides. Even Cordelia Mason, though she couldn't quite bring herself to speak directly to Eleanor, offered Frank a tight smile and a nod of acknowledgement. "I think we've been accepted," Frank murmured in Eleanor's ear as they took their places for the first dance. "It only took half the town realizing you weren't going to come to your senses and run away from the giantess," Eleanor replied with a wry smile. Frank's hand tightened at her waist. "Their loss is my gain," he said seriously. "And for the record, I've never thought of you as a giantess. Just as the perfect height for me." The evening passed in a blur of dancing, laughter, and warm conversation. Eleanor found herself welcomed into groups where she'd previously been excluded, invited to join committees she'd never been considered for, treated, in short, like any other young woman in town, albeit one who happened to be courted by one of our Ray's most eligible newcomers. Near midnight, as the celebration reached its peak, Frank led Eleanor outside for a moment of quiet. The town square was illuminated by lanterns hung from bare tree branches, creating a magical canopy of light above the snow-covered ground. "Happy?" Frank asked, drawing her close in the cold night air. "Incredibly," she replied, meaning it more than she could express. "I've been thinking," he said, his breath forming small clouds between them. "About the future, our future specifically." Eleanor's heart began to race. "Have you?" Frank nodded, suddenly serious. "Tom Hayes approached me last week with an offer. He wants to retire in a few years, move to Denver to be near his daughter. He's offering me the chance to buy into his operation now, become a full partner, and eventually take over completely." "Frank, that's wonderful," Eleanor exclaimed, genuinely delighted for him. "Your own ranch, just like you've dreamed of." "Almost," he corrected, his eyes intent on hers. "Dreams have a way of evolving, Eleanor. When I came to our Ray, all I wanted was land of my own, a place to put down roots. Now I want that and so much more." He took a deep breath. "I want a home with you in it, a life with you beside me." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth as he dropped to one knee in the snow before her. "Eleanor Willow Harrington," Frank said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. You are everything I never knew I needed: strong, kind, intelligent, and more beautiful to me with each passing day. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a small diamond set in silver, flanked by two tiny sapphires that matched the color of his eyes. "Yes," Eleanor whispered, tears of joy spilling onto her cheeks. "Yes, Frank, I will marry you." His smile could have outshone the stars as he rose to his feet and slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though made for her, which, Eleanor realized, it probably was, given Frank's attention to such details. "It's beautiful," she said, admiring the way the stones caught the lantern light. "Like its wearer," Frank replied, drawing her into his arms. "Perfect in every way." Their kiss, there in the snow beneath the canopy of lights, was a promise of all the years to come, years they would face together, standing tall and unashamed. When they returned to the dance, hand in hand with Eleanor's ring catching the light, their news spread quickly through the hall. Congratulations poured in from all sides. Glasses were raised in toasts to their happiness, and even Cordelia Mason managed a grudging best wishes. "When's the wedding to be?" Mrs. Tillman asked, already visibly planning her role in the festivities. Eleanor looked to Frank, realizing they hadn't discussed timing. "Spring," he answered confidently. "When the snow melts and the wildflowers return. If that suits my bride-to-be, spring sounds perfect," Eleanor agreed, her heart full to bursting. The winter months passed in a flurry of wedding preparations and practical arrangements for their future. Frank continued working for Eleanor's father while beginning his partnership with Tom Hayes, spending every available moment either with Eleanor or preparing for their life together. He found a piece of land just beyond the Harrington property, 10 acres, with a small cabin that could be expanded into a proper home. With George's blessing and assistance, Frank began improvements during the winter months, adding a second bedroom, enlarging the kitchen, and building a covered porch where he envisioned spending summer evenings with Eleanor at his side. Eleanor, meanwhile, sewed her wedding dress with her own hands, a creation of ivory silk ordered from Denver, with a design that accentuated her height rather than trying to minimize it. She prepared her trousseau, put together a household of linens and kitchenware, and dreamed of the life awaiting her as Mrs. Franklin Wade. Their wedding day dawned clear and perfect in early May 1879. The mountain peaks still wore caps of snow, but in the valley, wildflowers carpeted the meadows in a riot of color. The ceremony was held in Our Ray's small church, filled to capacity with townsfolk who, over the months of Eleanor and Frank's courtship, had come to see their love story as something of a local legend. As Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she held her head high, no longer conscious of her height, except as something to be celebrated. In her ivory dress with Frank's aspen leaf brooch pinned over her heart, she felt truly beautiful for perhaps the first time in her life. Frank waited at the altar, his eyes never leaving her face, his expression one of awe and adoration. When George placed Eleanor's hand in Frank's, The symbolism of the gesture wasn't lost on anyone present. One tall, strong person entrusting another tall, strong person with his most precious treasure. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, but Eleanor scarcely heard the familiar words. She was lost in Frank's blue eyes, in the gentle pressure of his hand holding hers, in the incredible reality that this man had chosen her, exactly as she was, without reservation or condition. Their vows were traditional but spoken with deep personal meaning. When Frank promised to cherish and honor her all the days of his life, Eleanor knew without doubt that he meant every word. And when she pledged herself to him in return, she did so with her whole heart, grateful beyond measure for the love they'd found together. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared at last. "You may kiss the bride." Frank cradled her face in his hands with infinite tenderness. "My wife," he whispered, just for her ears, before pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that sealed their union before God and their community. The celebration afterward, held at Harrington Haven, lasted well into the evening. Tables groaning with food were set up in the yard, lanterns were hung from trees, and a small band played music for dancing. Eleanor and Frank moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes from what seemed like the entire population of Auray County. Even Cordelia Mason, somewhat humbled by the undeniable evidence of Frank and Eleanor's happiness, offered sincere congratulations. "You make a handsome couple," she admitted, a new maturity in her voice. "I wish you both every happiness." As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink, Frank led Eleanor away from the celebration to a quiet spot beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the yard. From there, they could see both Harrington Haven and the smoke rising from the chimney of their own cabin in the distance, their past and their future, separated by just a few miles of rolling land. "Happy, Mrs. Wade?" Frank asked, his arms encircling her waist from behind as they watched the sunset. Eleanor leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "Completely," she assured him. "And you, Mr. Wade?" His lips found the sensitive spot just below her ear. "I have everything I ever wanted and more," he murmured. "A home, land of my own, and a wife who fits perfectly in my arms. What more could a man ask for?" Eleanor turned in his embrace to face him, her arms looping around his neck. "I never thought I'd find someone who would really see me the way you do," she confessed. "Someone who wouldn't wish I were different." "I wouldn't change a single thing about you," Frank said firmly. "Not 1 inch of your height, not one strand of your hair, not one thought in your brilliant mind. You are perfect exactly as you are, Eleanor Wade." The sound of her new name on his lips made her smile. "I love you, Franklin Wade." "And I love you," he replied, drawing her close for a kiss that promised forever. "Now and always." In the years that followed, Eleanor and Frank built a life together that exceeded even their most optimistic dreams. Their partnership with Tom Hayes flourished, eventually expanding into one of the most successful cattle operations in the region. Their home grew along with their fortunes, with additions that accommodated their growing family-first twins, a boy and girl named George and Margaret, born in the spring of 1880, then another son, Joseph, who arrived 2 years later. Eleanor's height, once a source of such pain and self-consciousness, became simply another aspect of who she was, notable perhaps, but no longer defining. In Auray, she was known not as the tall woman but as Mrs. Wade, a loving wife, devoted mother, and respected member of the community who served on the school board and organized relief efforts during harsh winters. Frank's prediction on their wedding day proved true through all the seasons of their marriage. Whether dancing at the town's social gatherings, working side by side on the ranch, or simply standing together watching their children play. They fit perfectly, two people whose differences complemented rather than conflicted, whose strengths supported each other's weaknesses, whose love deepened with each passing year. On their 20th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of the home they'd built together, watching the sunset gild the mountains in gold, Frank took Eleanor's hand, the same hand he'd held when asking for her first dance, when proposing marriage, when welcoming their children into the world. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "what might have happened if I hadn't come to our Ray that summer?" Eleanor considered the question, thinking of all the joys and sorrows they'd shared over 2 decades, the births of their children, the death of her father, the drought years and the prosperous ones, the thousands of everyday moments that made up a life well lived. "I believe we would have found each other somehow," she said finally. "Some things are simply meant to be." Frank raised her hand to his lips, kissing the finger that still wore his ring, now accompanied by a simple gold band. "Like a tall woman in the Cowboy who loves her." "Exactly like that," Eleanor agreed with a smile. "A perfect fit through and through." And as the last light of day faded from the sky, they remained hand in hand on their porch, two people who had found in each other not just love but acceptance, the greatest gift of all in a world that too often valued conformity over character, appearance over substance, fitting in over standing tall. In the end, Eleanor Willow Harrington Wade had learned that being different wasn't a curse, but a blessing. For it had led her to Franklin Wade, the one man who looked at her and saw not a woman who was too tall, but a woman who was exactly right. And in his eyes, she had finally found the reflection of her true self, beautiful, worthy and perfectly, wonderfully tall.